ball lovers, ball knowers, welcome back to another episode of the Bucks Beat here on WTMJ. I'm your host, Monis Khan, editor-in-chief of Bucks Plus, and every week here on the Bucks Beat, we're bringing you insight and analysis from the people who know the team best, the people on the beat. And no one knows the team better or follows the team closer than today's guest, the voice of the Milwaukee Bucks, play-by-play announcer on the Bucks radio network, Dave Koehn. You can hear Dave pretty much every game of this season, including this week when the team takes on Tuesday. They have a big game against Philly. Then our arch nemesis, the Washington Wizards, on Thursday, followed by a trip to Boston for what could be a very important game against the Boston Celtics. A nice little litmus test on what this team can do in the next few weeks, given that there's a little bit of uncertainty. Giannis said himself that he expects to be out a few weeks, although that has not been confirmed. The MRI diagnosis has not been concluded at this point here on Monday, but a lot in the air for the Bucks. The team sits at 18-26, 15-15 with Giannis, who's been very limited this season in terms of injury on a minutes restriction since he came back from his most recent injury. 3-11 without Giannis this season, and now facing what could be Giannis predicting 4 to 6 weeks him being out. He says he's going to work hard to get back, and hopefully with his team in striking distance of a play-in spot, get this team into the playoffs. That's what he wants to do. That's where his mindset is as the team approaches the trade deadline on February 5th. A lot going on, a lot at stake over the next few weeks for the Milwaukee Bucks. Big news in terms of Bucks Plus, the release of the latest Behind the Bucks podcast. That's our podcast, which is like a documentary style podcast. It's like a 30 for 30. And this week's topic, a moment in history that would change basketball forever. A surreal moment. Because if you're going to have a battle of superpowers face each other on the basketball court during the Cold War, where better to do it than in the frozen tundra, than at the Mecca, the Milwaukee Arena, where the Milwaukee Bucks in 1987 hosted the Soviet Union national team, the best national team in the world, and the EuroLeague champion Tracer Milan team, a European juggernaut club team, in a first-of-its-kind tournament called the McDonald's Open. Bucks Plus releasing the authoritative oral history of the 1987 McDonald's Open, and it's called Bucks versus the World. And when you're going to tell a story as important as this one, you're going to want an iconic voice to help you tell that story. And that's why Charlie Barron's beloved Wisconsin comedian is the narrator of this series. And if you're wondering, I've never heard of the McDonald's Open, what is this? Well, Charlie Barron's is going to break you down why this story is so important in a trailer that was just released to correspond with the debut of episode 1, which came out last Thursday. Here's the trailer.
The 1987 McDonald's Open.
Picture this, a star-powered Bucks team coming off 7 straight 50-win seasons. And their first opponent, Tracer Milan. One of the greatest international teams of all time. And Milan, they had a squad full of a few Hall of Famers and a familiar face with a famous mustache.
Mike D'Antoni.
But the Bucks matchup with Milan, I mean, that was just the appetizer. Or as they would call it in Italy, the antipasto. Which actually makes no sense. Why would they say antipasto? You know, I'm pro-pasto, if I'm being honest. Italians, man. The main course was a beef that had been marinating for 15 years. But it wasn't a good beef. It was a bad beef. Ever since Team USA had the gold medal stolen from them at the 72 Olympics, we had to settle the score. And in 1987, your Milwaukee Bucks finally had a chance for revenge against the best national team in the world, the Soviet Union.
Nico on the drive and the jam. Milwaukee Bucks made history today by becoming the first National Basketball Association team ever to face the Soviet Nationals. At stake, basketball supremacy in the United States.
This is the story of the only must-win preseason game, the highest stakes exhibition of all time, the one that would change the course of basketball forever. This is the oral history of the 1987 McDonald's Open.
Wow. Chills. Charlie. Hilarious. Every episode is a delight. I say that I'm biased. I wrote and I produced the series. 4 episodes over these next 4 weeks. Episode 1, you can listen to it now on the Bucks Plus podcast, Behind the Bucks, wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes coming out on every Thursday. So now when we come back after the break, we'll be talking to Dave Koehn. Dylan Hunter Carter is here showing you an exclusive preview of our Here District podcast where we host Terry Cummings, Bucks legend, star of that 87 McDonald's Open Bucks team, but also had him on the Here District podcast where he was in conversation with Marcus Johnson, this famous trade in Bucks history, one of the most pivotal trades in NBA history. Finally, Marcus, Terry on the same podcast, talking it out. Amazing episode of Here District. Very excited to have Bucks versus the World out on our Behind the Bucks podcast presented by Gallagher. We'll be back here on the Bucks Beat with more after this break. Welcome back to the Bucks Beat. I'm your host, Monis Khan. Join now. Now, every week here on the Bucks Beat, we try to bring you insight and analysis to with the people who know the team best. The people on the beat. Nobody, I don't know. Very few people know the team better, cover the team closer than our next guest, my buddy, Dave Koehn. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Monis, quite an introduction there. I'll try to live up to it, but it's one of the fun parts of being a voice of a team. You know, it's one of the things I enjoy most. You get to be embedded with the team, and you do get to set pretty good sense for what's going on with that team. So it's one of the perks.
And Bucks fans listening to WTMJ, listening to the Bucks Beat, know Dave because indeed he is the voice of the Bucks. You can hear him this week on Tuesday when the Bucks play Philadelphia, Thursday when they play our seemingly nemesis, Washington Wizards, the rival Washington Wizards. And can we get revenge on Thursday? Listen to Dave. He will let you know and entertain you during that broadcast. Hopefully what will be a great W for the Bucks. And Sunday, great game against the Boston Celtics. So a lot of Bucks basketball this week. And Dave comes to Milwaukee via the University of Virginia, where he covered the national champion Virginia Cavaliers. And before that, University of Vermont, Sam Houston State, Texas Lutheran. Dave is a Kansas Jayhawk, Colorado native. And I want to get started here, Dave. I want to know, you've been all around the world, man. Your career is really a testament to what it takes to be a broadcaster for an NBA team. You know, that winding journey that one would have to go on in order to reach this stage of your career. What stop on this journey do you think prepared you most for success in broadcasting?
That's a good question, Moses. I leave it to you to ask a good question right out of the gates. If I was to go back in time and tell you the most growth I had at any point in that long journey, I would say it was my first college job I had at Sam Houston State University when let's see, the one step you left off of my journey was the first one, which was, and I've said this to many young broadcasters that I've talked to through the years, that I am so grateful for the opportunity that I had to pay my dues, because I don't think you enjoy that view quite as much unless you have. And I started really small. You know, when I got out of college, my first goal, number one goal, I knew what I wanted to do, which is pretty fortunate. You know, there aren't too many people that can say they really know what they want to do when they get done with college, but I knew I wanted to do play-by-play. And I thought, whatever I have to do to get there, you know, I was really willing to move wherever, as evidenced by that series of stops that I had along the way, all over the country. And I was also willing to do whatever I had to do. And that meant, you know, doing sales. That meant doing morning DJ shifts, that kind of thing. Things that were outside of. I had a morning all topics talk show at one point, and this was in Colorado. My first stop out of college was at a small station in Loveland, Colorado, and I know I'm not specifically answering your question here, but it all leads to it. But in Colorado, I was in Loveland, Colorado, and then Estes Park. Those two, it was two sister stations. So Estes Park is where Rocky Mountain National Park is, all these things. And I had a morning talk show there. I remember it was all topics. And I'm out of college. I don't know the world at all. And so, I'm just kind of fake it till you make it. I do whatever I got to do. And so I was doing the show, and I'll never forget. I ran into this guy who was at the fitness center where I was working out, and he said, "Oh, you do sports over at that station?" He's like, "Oh yeah, you do a good job." He's like, that morning show guy though, I can't stand him." And I was like, "That's me." And so but it was, and it really, I mean, I'm sure it was a terrible morning show because I didn't know what I was talking about, but I did what I had to do, so it was just like you kind of had to just push through. And I think that morning show, by the end of it, got a lot better, actually, but it was right when I'd started doing it. I didn't know what I was doing. But anyway, all that to say, I was willing to go where I needed to and do what I needed to try to carve my niche in this profession. And then, and answer your question, my first job I took in the college ranks was at Sam Houston State. I moved to East Texas. I'm a Colorado guy moving to East Texas. Total culture shock. I mean, it was, I studied abroad in Spain and I studied in Australia. I didn't feel the culture shock in those places that I did in East Texas, living there for the first, couple months that I was there. I mean, it was a total shock to the system, but I was doing so many games. I was doing men's and women's basketball for Sam Houston State. I was doing college football for Sam Houston State. I was doing high school football. I was doing, high school basketball. And then I would do high school baseball. And then I would even do Little League baseball. I even did like a stock show once. I went out to like a stock show and I was like announcing that. And I had no idea what I was doing. But anyway, what I was doing was getting just tons of reps. And I was just, just refining those motor skills, so to speak, and making this so it was much more second nature. And so I felt like my improvement from the time I started there to the time I was done was huge. And it kind of just set the table for what I was going to go into. And, I was traveling all around. I was in my car. I was driving through East Texas, through all this stuff, to all these stops and these crazy little gyms that I'd be going to. And at that time, it was the Southland Conference. And I'm not even sure what it is now. College sports has been changing so much. I'm sure Sam Houston State's not in the Southland Conference anymore. But the schools you'd go to, I remember, anyway, there's so many stories that come from it. I was at McNeese State. There was a cat that lived in that arena. And that cat, during the game, it would sneak up under your feet as your press row, and this cat would be walking between your feet, and it just lived there. And anyway, so these kinds of things. There was at Nichols State, one of the coaches lost his fingertip because he was partying in a bar, and he got it caught in like the fan on the roof. I mean, crazy, like, this is just only in the South kind of stuff. I mean, it was just stuff I'd never experienced. So it was great life experience, and it was great broadcasting experience. So there's a very long-winded question to your first question. So there you go.
No, I mean, I think it's just important to realize that these sorts of no job too small type of mentality is really what it takes to succeed in a type of role like play-by-play. I'm always amazed and impressed by how many different sports play-by-play announcers can kind of throw themselves into and be able to like own and be experts of. And so, Dave, I think your career is a testament to being able to call all these different sports. And one thing I'm curious about, because WTMJ listeners will understand where I'm coming from, Dave, that radio voice is yours. Holy moly, we're just enjoying all the climactic moments in Bucks basketball. You really hit those notes, my friend. Where'd that come from? How long did it take for you to find your voice as a play-by-play broadcaster?
Another good one. Man, you just keep coming at me with these good questions. Yeah, to find your voice. So that's a two-part answer from my perspective, in that on one hand, I was very fortunate to have been born with a voice like this, and I'd never had to do like voice lessons or anything like that. I even go back to when I was a kid, and I was never a very good musician. I played the piano for a brief period of time. But one thing I always had was an ear for it. So I could, I wasn't always great playing music off of notes, but I had an ear for what sounded good, and I could repeat that sound. And I think that some of that lends itself to my delivery in terms of as a broadcaster too, to, as you put it, hit those right notes. But that said, there is some level to learning what is your signature sound, particularly for big moments. And I think that's something that takes a little bit of time. I'd say I probably, and I guess you're still always tweaking it. So I guess I can't say that I have fully arrived at exactly what I want my sound, but I think I'm mostly there. And I would say that probably in my time, all the way to Virginia, I feel like is when, which was where I was for 13 years prior to here. But early in my time at Virginia, I kind of think I sort of more or less mastered my big call in how to punch those moments. And, everybody's got their own style. Some people are way more over the top than others. Some people are way more understated than others. And so you've got your own personal style and what seems right to you, what feels natural to you. And I think I discovered that probably most adeptly at that time, I would say.
And at Virginia, that's when Dave saw the highest of highs and some of the lowest of lows on the court. And we're going to talk about that when we come back here on the Bucks Beat after this break. We are back here on the Bucks Beat, and I'm your host, Monis Khan, joined by Dave Koehn, the voice of the Milwaukee Bucks. You know him, you love him, and he makes all the Bucks games, win or lose, so much fun to listen to. And Dave, when you were at the University of Virginia, before you became the play-by-play announcer for the Bucks Radio Network, you covered the Tony Bennett era, where you famously became the only broadcaster to call a game where the first seed lost to the 16th seed in the NCAA tournament. And then the next year, you covered a national championship team. I want to talk about Tony Bennett, Wisconsin. He's got Wisconsin roots, certainly very famous, certainly very acclaimed. They're naming the court after him at UVA. And I'm just curious what you think about that honor that he's receiving.
Yeah. And let me also just say, not only am I one of the only broadcaster to call a one losing to a 16 and then a national title, I'm one of only two broadcasters that have ever called a one losing to a 16 period. It had never happened before it happened to us. So at that point I was one of one. And then Purdue followed up and almost did exactly what Virginia did, because they lost in the finals after losing in the first round. So I don't know, coaches, write it down. Maybe this is the path to success. Get a one seed, lose in the first round. Next year you got a path to the title. But it did work for the Bucks, or I should say for the Cavaliers in that case, under Tony Bennett. And yeah, Tony is, to me, one of the really profoundly impactful people, not only in my career, but in my life in a lot of ways. He is just one of one, and in some ways has actually, been a bit of a mentor to me. In just life, living life the way I want to, and in the way I think that you should live life. He's just such a principled individual and such a high character person that goes well beyond his coaching chops, which are immense. But yeah, to have had the opportunity to meet him my second year at Virginia, which was his first season there, and be with him for 12 years was just an unbelievable, fortunate set of circumstances for me as a person, and to have him in my life and kind of see how he goes about doing things. And in some ways, we're actually wired somewhat similarly, so I think our personalities always jived in that sense. And I'm grateful for that fact, to still be friends with him to this day. But as far as, his deservingness to have that court dedication, no, he doesn't deserve it. He has no business having that court's named after him. No, I'm kidding. He absolutely couldn't be more deserving of that honor. And the funny thing is, I know there's probably nobody that's dreading that dedication more than Tony Bennett. That was the one thing that was always a challenge for me with him. He hates being in the spotlight. And so, from a perspective of a guy who had to have him in the spotlight regularly to interview him and use him for these things, I always, I'd go to these, donor events with him, and he was always so good when he was there. But boy, did he hate going to these things and being in that spotlight. It drove him crazy. So, But his problem was he was too good at it. He'd show up and he'd just light the room up, and so it was just like, well, we got to use you now. And so, but all that to say, I'm sure whenever this dedication is happening, I guess they moved it from, it was supposed to be over the last weekend, and now I think it's against Miami, maybe in a week or two. And unfortunately, right after we leave I'll be back in town there around that time in Charlottesville, but we leave for the All-Star break. I'll have to leave, so I'm going to miss it, which is a bummer. But he's the best.
And now you are here in Milwaukee, where Doc Rivers is the winningest, Tony Bennett, the winningest head coach in UVA history. Doc Rivers, currently among active coaches in the NBA, no one has more wins than Doc Rivers. And another, legendary coach. Dave, you've had to build relationships as like the voice of the Bucks with, and throughout your career with many different types of head coaches who have many different types of personalities. What's your approach to building that rapport so that you can be the best storyteller that you can for fans?
Yeah, every situation's different, and every coach is different in how that looks and what that relationship is going to be like, because I'll say one of the things that's a little trickier in terms of building a substantive relationship with a head coach at the NBA level, at least in our situation, is that I don't have that regular one-on-one FaceTime. In the NBA, I used to have a coaches show every week with Tony Bennett. So whether he liked it or not, he was stuck there with me, and we got to know each other through that process. I don't have that with the Bucks. So in that sense, I don't have that regularly baked in time with that coach where sometimes you can develop that relationship. Now, that said, that's not to say I don't have a relationship with these guys, but it's just, I don't know. I think it's harder to be as in-depth as maybe it was when I was at Virginia from that sense, just maybe for no other reason because of that. But, even that said, look, this is, I think the other part of the NBA is it is much more of a business, and there is such a higher volume of games. So the bandwidth is less. And so, there's the other thing with a guy like Doc, which I'm always amazed by, is his journey has been so long. He knows, he is the Forrest Gump of the NBA. I mean, he knows everybody. He has experienced everything that's happened in this game because, I mean, think about it. This guy goes, his time goes, he knows these guys that were playing in the 70s. When he was coming into the league, some of his vets were these guys that were playing in the 70s that he got to know. And then you go all the way through his playing career to the early 90s. And then next thing you know, he's a broadcaster, so he's experiencing that side, knowing everybody on the media landscape. And then he's a head coach starting in the early 2000s. So, I mean, really, you're talking about, what is that, 5 decades worth of people that he has connection to, which is just remarkable. And one of the things that has always impressed me is his ability to connect with people, unlike anyone I've ever seen. I've never seen a coach with that gravitas and that ability to connect with people. And, you can see why he's lasted as long as in this league as he has, because he has a tremendous relationships with people around this thing, and he really embraces that. So that's been kind of cool to see and get a little taste of it. But, all that to say, you also realize, look, I'm one of a zillion people this guy knows. So it's not, you just you have to be, you just have to be organic with it. And you have to be yourself, but you also have to learn how that coach operates, what his thinking pattern is, and what he wants, because that's what the relationship really needs to be. It's not what you want. You're an ancillary piece in this whole operation as a broadcaster. I mean, you're there to tell the story. You're also there to not become part of the story, and you're there to ultimately, especially as the voice of a team, you're there to help project, this franchise in the best light you can, and while also telling what you see. I mean, there's reporting that goes with this too, so it's not just sugarcoating everything you see, and that can be a delicate dancing act as well. But nonetheless, yeah, to answer your question with Doc, it is a different dynamic, but it's been a fun one to get to know him. And but you also realize he's got a lot of people in his orbit. In fact, in the NBA, you're not the only voice either. Lisa Byington is also there. So there's 2 of us, and then there are the crews associated with each. So there's just a lot more in the ecosystem.
And we'll be continuing our discussion with Dave Koehn, the voice of the Milwaukee Bucks, here on the Bucks Radio Network. You can listen to Dave every Bucks game on WTMJ. And we'll be back with Dave after the break to talk about the team a little bit more. You're listening to the Bucks Beat here on WTMJ, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Bucks Beat. I'm here talking to Dave Koehn, the voice of the Milwaukee Bucks, the team's play-by-play announcer on the Bucks Radio Network. You can listen to Dave this week on Tuesday against the Philadelphia 76ers, Thursday against Washington, Sunday against Boston. It's a big week for the Bucks. Dave, you called the game where Giannis was playing in the last game against Denver. Did you get the feeling that he was playing hurt?
Yeah, I did. In fact, I was talking to my broadcast partner about it after the fact, Justin Garcia, and we were both saying. I mean, I specifically commented on the fact. I said he doesn't look the same tonight. There's something that's not quite the same with him. I said it on the air, and I said there was one move he made where he had burst and he blew by his guy, but prior to that, Zeke Naji was locking him down in a way that guys don't normally lock Giannis down. He just was not able to get that edge. And it just something looked off. And, and sure enough, as we came to learn, something was off. And I would make the case it felt like even before that game there were times. But that game in particular, it felt like maybe it just wasn't, something was amiss. And sure enough, we see that there was, as Giannis ultimately, unfortunately, had that injury that's going to take him out for the next extended period of time, and carrying on what's been a bit of a tough pattern for Giannis, certainly over the last couple of years, dealing with that calf.
And there's so much noise around Giannis this season, so much scrutiny as the team has not performed up to their own stated expectations. The Bucks are 15-15 with Giannis this season and only 3-11 without him. Clearly, he's been dealing with an injury all season long, missed a portion of training camp with COVID, and just a number of things disrupting the flow of Giannis' season. A lot of scrutiny over his leadership, like very close look at what he's saying in every single press conference, post-game, parsing everything he has to say. But Dave, he has been clear. He is locked in on his teammates, on his team. He is wearing the Milwaukee Bucks jersey. He is committed to this city and this franchise. And in that game against Denver, that's what you saw. You saw a guy with no explosiveness, feeling the pain of that calf the entire game, pushing it to its absolute limit. What did that mean to you, Dave, in terms of his commitment to this team in this season?
Well, one of the things with Giannis that I think is so impressive is his pain threshold and his toughness, that I don't think we even have a real glimmer of the true situation that he deals with regularly in these games. I remember talking with some of the folks associated with him that said, if Giannis ever wrote a book about everything he's done, people would be shocked. And we've seen glimpses of it over the course of his career, of course, in the championship in 2021 when he came back from that knee injury and everything that came with it. But this guy is singular in his focus. It really is amazing when you talk about the competitive fire. I was actually fortunate enough to have a conversation with him a couple weeks ago about competitive fire and mental toughness. And it was something that I broached. I heard a quote from Novak Djokovic, and he said something. It was something along the lines of, mental toughness is not something that is a gift to you. It's not inherent. He said it's something that has to be worked on and cultivated, and that's it. And it never ends. That process, essentially never ends. So I asked Giannis about it, and he, couldn't have agreed more with that assessment. And interestingly enough, was a Novak Djokovic fan too, so he was very familiar with him. But it was just really interesting to go inside his mindset and where this comes from. And I said, is this for you a product of your upbringing? Where does it come from? And in that competitiveness, that part of you that's just relentless in nature. And he said, maybe the mental toughness component, because when you've gone through things like I did early in my life, that it prepares you to deal with things later in life. And he said, look, Novak Djokovic, he's another guy. This is a guy who was born in war-torn Serbia, correct? And so he, this is a situation where you're ready for things later in life. Doesn't seem like such a big deal when you've been through some of these other things that some of these guys have been. But he also said, I was born with a competitive fire. I've always had that. That was something that was in me from the time I was a kid. So kind of an interesting glimpse into his mind and how it works. But yeah, he's remarkable. And, you just keep your fingers crossed that you rest things up, and hopefully some of these injuries that he's been dealing with lately are not something that you have to deal with much more, because it's a shame to see his greatness not able to reach its potential, as we talk about. You can tell when he's not quite right, and he wasn't quite right. But, one thing about Giannis is, I will give him this. He is accountable. He is there, and he answers the questions. And it's a tough spot to be in. You talked about the fact that he's been under the microscope, all his words parsed and measured and studied in 18 different angles, of course, across the internet. Imagine you're going through a tough stretch in your life, and you got to explain it every time one of these things happen. Like you have a tough loss, and you have a microphone in front of you. It'd be really easy to say, "No, I'm not talking about it tonight." But he does, to his credit, every game. And so after each of those games, he faces the fire. So, it's pretty commendable.
Certainly commendable. And we saw that mental toughness that you discussed with Giannis. We saw that on the court against Denver. Everyone is wondering, will he or won't he, this and that. The man shows up. His stats have been electric this season, even though he's playing with injury on limited minutes. And once again, just defying the odds and doing the impossible. I mean, that's what he's done his entire career. He said he's going to work his butt off. I don't think the diagnosis or the timeline has necessarily been released at this point. But whatever it is, we're wishing him health, a speedy recovery. And his intention is to be back for this team in the home stretch, get into the play-in, and this team has stated in the news that it believes it can compete with anybody in the East, and that if they can get into the dance, that they expect to make a run. And Dave will be calling those games and leading us through this stretch of games into the All-Star break, through the All-Star break. Dave, delighted to finally have you here on the Bucks Beat. I've been really looking forward to it, and thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure, Monis. Glad to do it with you.
And we'll be back with Dylan Hunter Carter, the producer of our Here District podcast for Bucks Plus. After this break, you're listening to the Bucks Beat here on WTMJ. Welcome back to the Bucks Beat. I am Monis Khan. I'm here by Dylan Hunter Carter every week here on the Bucks Beat. He's a producer of the Here District podcast, and a very special episode. If you know anything about Bucks history, you've been waiting for this episode. Finally, 199 episodes in, we have Terry Cummings joining Here District this week. Dylan, what was it like for you just having Terry on the pod?
I'm sitting in this call with him and Marcus and Chris, and I'm just feeling the legacy oozing from this conversation. I mean, guys who have seen everything, know everything, have more ball knowledge in their pinky than most of us have in our lifetimes. So it was really an incredible conversation to be a part of.
And Terry's joining the show because he was one of the stars of the Bucks teams that performed in the 1987 McDonald's Open. And with us, Bucks Plus, launching our Bucks versus the World oral history of this historic tournament earlier last week, we had Terry on the show to talk about his experience. Dylan, what stood out for you about Terry's experience playing in the McDonald's Open?
It's very interesting knowing the context of what that game meant now versus what Terry's perspective on it was at the time. He had no idea that this would be such an important moment in globalizing basketball, taking the NBA to an international stage and vice versa, because this also paved the way for, international players to be brought into the NBA and playing in the Olympics as well. This is pretty much the reason why we have the Dream Team. So this was such a pivotal moment, but at the time, for a guy like Terry who's just laser focused on his craft, beating guys in the low post, that's all he cares about. He's not really thinking about this stuff. And so, looking back at it, he was definitely able to have a little bit of a different perspective and see why it was so important. But in that moment, it's just another game. All he wants to do is punk these fools.
And it's fun in the series. You'll hear him remembering that he won the MVP of that first ever McDonald's Open, and he just didn't even know. And the other MVPs, every other year, there are 9 McDonald's championships. The name change after a few years. There are 9. And it's Michael Jordan, Tim Duncan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Walter Davis. It's the best basketball players of that era who were awarded the MVP of those tournaments. All of them in the Hall of Fame. Terry a finalist for the Naismith Hall of Fame this year, a finalist one again. Dylan, what do you think? How would you like Terry to be remembered in basketball history after listening to that conversation?
It's funny, that list really opened my eyes because it's genuinely, you've got like 5 or 6 of the 10 greatest basketball players of all time who have all won this award. And I think it contextualizes just how important of a player Terry was for his era. He's one that doesn't necessarily always get the glitz and the glam because, the 90s roll around and Jordan kind of overshadows all of the 80s, right? Besides, Magic and Bird become the 2 stories that people rip from that era of basketball. But this is 10 years of a sport where Terry is at the forefront of it. 2 different teams as well. He had an incredible Milwaukee Bucks era, and then he had his great years with the San Antonio Spurs. Almost 20 years in the league, consistently at the top of his game, someone who impacted winning at every level. So I feel like Terry, he's certainly someone who belongs in the Hall of Fame, but also someone who I feel like if we did a little bit more research, we would see just how impactful he was on basketball history as a whole.
And when we come back here on the Bucks Beat, Dylan and I are going to talk about the trade that sent Marcus Johnson to Los Angeles to play for the Clippers and Terry Cummings to the Bucks. A very pivotal moment in Bucks history. We'll be back here on the Bucks Beat after this break. Welcome back to the Bucks Beat. I'm joined by Dylan Hunter Carter, the producer of Here District, where this week Marcus Johnson and his son Chris Johnson are hosting Terry Cummings, all-pro, all-star player for the Milwaukee Bucks in the 80s, led them to the Eastern Conference Finals, multiple 50-win seasons, was the final part of John Nelson's coaching career with the Bucks. He was a leader of those teams. Dylan, the trade. What was it like for you listening to Terry and Marcus talk about when they were swapped for one another in one of the most pivotal trades in Bucks history?
Well, I was racking my brain trying to think of a time where we got to see 2 guys who were highly regarded in their craft. We're talking about all-stars, guys who were in all-NBA contention, sitting down and having a conversation about being traded for each other, which, first of all, when you have players of that caliber being traded for each other, it's pretty rare. Most of the time when it happens, it's also like a big shocking moment. We just had it with Anthony Davis and Luka, and we think about how the whole basketball world stopped for a moment. That became the story for, really several months, right? At the time, this was almost at that level. Maybe not quite, but these are 2 of the best, most elite players in basketball who are getting swapped for each other. And hearing Marcus give his perspective on how he was excited at first because he's from LA, and so it was a bit of a homecoming, and then he gets there and he realizes Donald Sterling's the owner of the Clippers and things are not great, and he's talking about going to Economy Lodge and staying in a motel basically for training camp versus the perspective of Terry, who is thinking, I got to get out of here. And he's got this sort of incredible story. I don't want to spoil it here, where he's talking about a dream that he had about playing for a team in a green jersey. He knew he didn't want to play for the Celtics for one reason or another. So he kind of envisioned this coming home. He's a guy from Chicago and then built this legacy with the Bucks. Just an all-around fascinating conversation, one I was really excited to hear on the show.
So an amazing week for Bucks Plus this week. On Tuesday, January 27th, this interview with Terry Cummings on the Here District podcast, talking to Marcus Johnson, drops on the Bucks official YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. And on Thursday, January 29th, episode 2 of Bucks versus the World. And we're taking a peek behind the Iron Curtain. What was life like in the Soviet Union in the 80s? Woo, it's bleak back there. Another amazing episode of Bucks vs. the World. Big week here on Bucks Plus. Thank you, Dylan, as always, for joining us here on the Bucks Beat. And we'll be back next Monday here on the Bucks Beat, talking about your favorite team. Can't wait. Until then, stay warm, Wisconsin. And we'll be back next week here on the Bucks Beat. Until then, take care.